In case you're interested in the idea of synchronicity and want to acquire a better understanding about its meaning, then you've come to the right video. Throughout this video, I'll discuss what Carl Jung meant when he spoke about synchronicity, how he developed this term, whether there's any proof that synchronicity is actually real, and towards the end of this video, I will also discuss the potential far-reaching implications in case synchronicity actually exists. So synchronicity is a rather mysterious and complicated principle developed by Carl Jung, and he mostly wrote about synchronicity throughout this book, which is essentially the 8th volume of Carl Jung's collected works. So for his psychological practice, Carl Jung was once visited by a young female patient who, as Jung observed, was psychologically inaccessible. As Jung indicated, this patient knew everything better, and her extreme rationality prevented Jung from making any progress with her treatment. As such, Jung hoped that something would happen which would break her wall of defense. Jung wrote, "I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself." Jung's wish was swiftly granted when Jung's patient was sharing an intense dream she had a few nights before. During this dream, somebody gave a golden scarab to Jung's patient, and while she was sharing this dream, Jung noted that a large insect was knocking against the window from the outside. Jung found this strange because the room was quite dark, and as such of not much interest to this insect. Jung opened the window and caught the insect, which turned out to be a large beetle, and this golden green insect looked like the closest local resemblance to a golden scarab. And as such, when Jung gave the insect to his patient, saying, "Here is your scarab," the patient dropped her defenses, and this led to a successful continuation of her treatment. And throughout this book, Jung shared several of such stories, and the question that we can ask is whether this is a coincidence or whether something else is going on. Jung indicated that he often observed such phenomenon, which he would later call synchronicity, within his own life as well as within the lives of many of his patients. Jung observed as well that most of his patients did not like to speak about these stories with the outside world for fear of being ridiculed. Jung wrote, "I was amazed to see how many people have had experiences of this kind and how carefully the secret was guarded. So my interest in this problem has a human as well as a scientific foundation." Fundamentally, Jung developed the synchronicity principle to explain events and experiences which cannot be explained by causality. These events, they require a principle beyond causality to understand their occurrence. As discussed later in this video as well, the existence of such a phenomenon has far-reaching implications for the place of our psyche within the world. As Jung observed, modern science has made us consider natural law as the governing principle of all that happens within the world. For example, natural law may define that a certain event, which we may call event A, will always result in event B, whereas a certain event called event C will never result in event A. However, how can it then be explained? Jung questioned that on some occasions event C does result in event A. As Jung argued, the principle underlying the statistical truths of natural law, causality, cannot explain these events. As such, Jung argued that another principle may exist which can explain such acausal events. Jung wrote, "The connection of events may in certain circumstances be other than causal, and requires another principle of explanation." Jung called this other principle of explanation synchronicity. You may wonder, however, whether there exists any proof that such a principle may be real. Jung indicated that in order to answer this question, we must separate acausal events from causal events. We should be looking for events which cannot be explained by causality, but can also not be explained by mere chance. Events which are highly unlikely but can still be explained by chance should as such not be included. Jung, for example, indicated that if on a certain day one's number on one's tram ticket, the number in the cinema, and the number of a phone call coming in are all strikingly similar, we might be tempted to consider these events acausal. However, Jung observed that although highly rare, such an occurrence may still be explained by causality and chance. As such, Jung did not consider such an event to be explainable through the synchronicity principle. The term synchronicity may, however, be applied to instances where chance cannot ultimately explain the apparent lack of causality. Jung wrote, "In such circumstances we are inclined to say that cannot be mere chance, without knowing what exactly we are saying." According to Jung, as soon as an event exceeds the limits of chance, we might determine that there exists a meaningful cross-connection, i.e. synchronicity. Moreover, as discussed in more detail later in this video as well, in order for there to exist a meaningful cross-connection, the external event must in some ways be linked to the internal world of the psyche. For instance, in the example of a similar number appearing multiple times throughout the day, this event may still be called synchronicity in case, according to Jung, the individual experiencing the event had a previous internal experience in relation to this number. An example may be a profound dream during which the number also appeared multiple times. If this happens, a causal explanation becomes impossible according to Jung, and synchronicity may be used to explain such an occurrence. In this case, synchronicity can explain the connection between an internal event of the psyche, which relates closely to something that happens in the outside world. As Jung elaborated, the apparent inexplicability of such events results from the reality that such events cannot be explained in rational terms. Jung wrote, "As I have already said, however, their inexplicability is not due to the fact that the cause is unknown, but to the fact that a cause is not even thinkable in intellectual terms. However, as Jung also observed, these difficulties when it comes to explaining such an event may also be a direct result of our unlimited confidence in causality." Jung wrote, "It is only the ingrained belief in the sovereign power of causality that creates intellectual difficulties and makes it appear unthinkable that causeless events exist or could ever occur." In such an instance, Jung believed that there exists an elastic connection between the psyche and space and time. Jung wrote, "Rhine's experiments show that in relation to the psyche, space and time are, so to speak, elastic, and can apparently be reduced almost to a vanishing point, as though they were dependent on psychic conditions and did not exist in themselves but were only postulated by the conscious mind." Before elaborating on Rhine's experiments, to which Jung is here referring, it is interesting to elaborate on the connection between space and time. Jung argued that space and time have only become definite concepts in the course of the mental development of humanity. Essentially, as Jung argued, space and time, they consist of nothing. They're merely a product of the psyche. The concept of space and time, as Jung observed, may therefore have merely been developed to satisfy the human need of somebody who wants to explain the world. Jung wrote, "If space and time are only apparently properties of bodies in motion and are created by the intellectual needs of the observer, then their relativization by psychic conditions is no longer a matter of astonishment, but is brought within the bounds of possibility." And the experiments conducted by J.B. Rhine illustrated this point according to Jung. Jung wrote, "The possibility presents itself when the psyche observes not external bodies but itself. It is a product of pure imagination, of chance ideas which reveal the structure of that which produces them, namely the unconscious." So what then are these experiments conducted by Rhine to which Jung is referring? Essentially, Rhine conducted experiments to investigate the potential existence of extrasensory perception, ESP. To conduct these experiments, Rhine would lay out a pack of 25 cards, which he divided into 5 groups of 5 cards. And each of these 5 cards consisted of cards with 5 different symbols. As such, each card within this group of 5 cards was unique. In each experiment, these cards were laid down 800 times in front of an individual who was then supposed to guess the symbol on the cards without seeing the symbol. And the expected result, based on probability, was that the subjects would guess on average 1 correct card out of each 5 cards, meaning 5 correct cards out of each pack of 25 cards. However, the average after conducting the experiment numerous times was 6.5 correct cards out of the 25 cards. As Jung observed, this was impressive. He wrote, "The probability of a chance deviation of 1.5 amounts to only 1 in 250,000. Moreover, even when Rhine conducted the same experiments with the subjects being far removed from himself and the table of cards, even up to 4,000 miles, the results they remained the same. Rhine then conducted another experiment whereby he would not lay the cards down until after the subject had made its guesses, sometimes even waiting up to 2 weeks after the subject had guessed the cards. And the results coming out of this experiment were equally impressive, and they had a probability of 1 in 400,000. The third experiment consisted of subjects attempting to influence the result of mechanically thrown dice, which also had impressive results. As Jung observed, these experiments, they illustrated that the psyche may be able to surpass the time and space constraints. Jung wrote, "The result of the spatial experiments proved with tolerable certainty that the psyche can to some extent eliminate the space factor. The time experiment proves that the time factor can become physically relative. The experiment with dice proves that moving bodies too can be influenced psychically." Although such conclusions may be a bit hard to believe, Jung himself was not surprised, since he believed that space and time were concepts which existed in close relationship to the psyche. However, before getting too excited, it must be noted that Ryan's experiments have been criticized heavily and that other researchers were not able to reproduce the results of Ryan. Jung, however, merely used these experiments from Ryan to attempt to find a scientific basis for his own rather mysterious experiences, as well as the experiences from his patients, such as the experience with the golden scarab, which I discussed in the beginning of this video. At the same time, however, Jung himself observed that these anecdotal experiences would not be enough to convince anybody of the existence of the principle of synchronicity. After carefully examining all of these examples of experiences which Jung discussed throughout his book, Jung observed that these experiences can be grouped into three categories. Number one, the coincidence of a psychic state in the observer with a simultaneous objective external event that corresponds to the psychic state or content, such as the golden scarab. Number two, the coincidence of a psychic state with a corresponding more or less simultaneous external event taking place outside the observer's fields of perception, i.e. at a distance and only verifiable afterwards. Number three, the coincidence of a psychic state with a corresponding not yet existent future event that is distant in time and can likewise only be verified afterwards. As such, synchronicity can be seen as the connection between a certain state of the psyche and the occurrence of an external event, which corresponds closely to the state of the psyche. Jung wrote, "Synchronicity therefore consists of two facts. A. An unconscious image comes into a consciousness either directly or indirectly, in the form of a dream, idea, or premonition. And B. An objective situation coincides with this content. In the case of the story of the golden scarab, the unconscious image consists of the intense dream experienced by Jung's patient, whereas the beetle which flew into the room represents the coinciding objective situation. The question then remains, according to Jung, is how and where from the initial unconscious image arises, as well as how the coinciding objective situation arises. Jung himself also already hinted to an answer, and Jung believed that the archetypes of the collective unconscious may play a role in this synchronistic event. According to Jung, when consciousness is suppressed to a certain degree, then the unconscious may slip into the space vacated. Jung believed that many examples of synchronistic events reveal their archetypal nature. The scarab, for instance, is an archetypal symbol of rebirth, which may relate closely to the events experienced by Jung's patient at that time. So sadly, in order to explain the idea of synchronicity, Jung relied heavily on the experiments carried out by Ryan. However, as indicated, these experiments have become seriously disputed years after Jung used them to argue in favor of the existence of synchronicity, and as such there remains probably no scientific evidence pointing to the existence of the synchronicity principle. What remains of proof of the existence of this principle is limited. Jung shared several anecdotal examples, such as the example of the golden scarab, and as a result it is largely up to us to decide whether we believe that synchronicity exists or not. Perhaps you can also remember some examples from your own life, or perhaps some events may happen in the future whereby the idea of synchronicity may offer a better explanation than causality. This is mostly the case in case something happens which relates closely to something which has occurred within the psyche and an external event that happens following this internal experience. In such an instance, it may be interesting to see whether the idea of synchronicity can offer an explanation. Jung himself, although a serious believer in synchronicity, could not establish whether such events are frequent or not. Jung believed that they are extremely rare, but also argued that they may appear more frequently than what we may expect. If synchronicity indeed exists, then Jung observed that the consequences are far-reaching. Jung wrote, "They prove that the content perceived by an observer can, at the same time, be represented by an outside event, without any causal connection. From this it follows either that the psyche cannot be localized in space, or that space is relative to the psyche." So thank you very much for watching this video. Please let me know in the comments whether you believe synchronicity is real or not. And if it's real, then it would also be interesting to share the story which makes you believe that synchronicity is actually real.